I've been walking Central Park, singing after dark. People think I'm crazy about that Stick to Wrestling podcast. I want to thank my friends at the Rolling Stones for referencing their favorite podcast 3 times in that classic song. I also want to encourage everyone to follow Stick to Wrestling on Facebook. We have a Facebook discussion page that is wicked cool. Give us 60 minutes, and we will perhaps indeed give you a raw bone podcast. Sure, there are some good wrestling podcasts out there, but are they wicked good? I also want to encourage you to follow me on Twitter, where I don't always stick to wrestling, but just put in a search John McAdam and follow the guy who has an avatar of 2 guys fighting with chairs. Be part of my march to 1 million Twitter followers. And with that, we are going to continue, Sean and I, our conversation with Mr. Bob Parsons, which was very fun and informative. Let's go to that now.
I know this is going to be a minority and unpopular opinion, but for as highly regarded as Jerry Blackwell is in hindsight, he just looked like a guy you could get away from with a brisk walking pace. I mean, yeah, he can throw a drop kick and he's a wrestler, and there is no doubt that he is a really tough guy. But, you know, for God's sake, eat a salad, man.
You know, Blackwell was really good earlier in his career, and for obvious reasons, he really started to fall off. I noticed in '86 he was having a really hard time getting around.
It's the height thing. I mean, if he was like 6'3", 6'4", being that big, it'd be awesome. It'd be like King Kong Bundy. But what was he, Bob? Was he like 5'8", 5'9"?
I would say, yeah, exactly. I no more than that.
At that point, it's not an awesome look.
But he had passed through Central States before going to the AWA, and in that little Kansas City ring, he looked like a monster. But that ring was probably 4 feet shorter than most conventional rings on each side. So a guy like Black Angus Campbell, who's probably 6'4", looked like Andre the Giant. That was part of the fun at Kansas City. That tiny little ring made everybody look enormous.
And the production on that TV was horrible. I mean, it was like wrestling in the dark. I mean, even like when things weren't bad, in like 82, 83, I mean, you know, get some lights up aimed at the arena. It was like way too dark.
Well, the format that Geigel was using for most of the time I was watching Central States, and this would be from 71 up to probably about late 76 when I left for college, was he would be using 2 or 3 week old footage from the live shows in Kansas City to set things up. Very seldom the main event blow-off matches, but he had a pretty frugal operation by all reputation.
Oh, yeah. So anyway, we promised that we're going to finish up our mailbag, and we've got Bob here to help us out with that. Sean, what's the first question we have?
If Starrcade 87 gets on pay-per-view with no block from Vince, does it save JCP?
I'll defer to somebody who knows what they're talking about. I would speculate, I would certainly think so. That was a very critical time to get maximum exposure, and I don't see how it could have hurt. Save it? Maybe not.
Yeah, I was going to say save it, not save it, and let me say why. Dusty Rhodes, every booker has a shelf life, okay? By 87, it was pretty clear that Dusty, you know, he was just burned out being booker. 88 made that even more clear. And, you know, the company got sold, and Jim Crockett was retained as a consultant. And Jim Crockett would write letters to Jim Herd or whoever else expressing his opinion that Dusty Rhodes was the only one who could come in and save that company. So if Crockett still owned it and he was still standing by Dusty, there was no turnaround. He just could not see that light. I will tell you that Vince basically killing Starrcade 87 was a death blow to WCW. It was like them getting shot in the stomach, and for the next year, they sat there and bled to death until Turner picked it up, because they were counting on that money to pay some of the promotions debt, which they had accumulated. They started losing money in 87, and when none of that money came through, that was the end for JCP. Sean, what do you think?
Let's focus on the debt, shall we? When we think of this era, I have one image. It's 3 guys in fur coats, body-length fur coats, walking into a Las Vegas resort at 100 degrees. There has to be somebody in the company who looks at that and says, you know what? We may have a business model problem right now. I mean, what you can't look at how they're operating with their, when Rick was telling you about the jet flying, they were doing that.
Yeah.
And that's expensive.
Time.
Exactly. So, I mean, it's somebody, all this did was speed up the process. That's all it did. You cannot, you're having these ridiculous concerts in their shows. I mean, they were spending way too much money, and they had to produce at a level that was not sustainable. And second, they had a couple bad months. Bye.
Yeah, and plus Crockett moved to a very expensive office in Dallas in 1987. He purchased the UWF for $4 million and certainly did not get his money's worth. Not that he paid the whole thing, but it just wasn't a good idea. And so to answer the question, it definitely would have helped, but I don't think it would have saved the promotion.
They were self-destructing either way. From Steve Russum, all things considered, who are a couple of guys that you've been around that had the best mind for the business, or are you people that you're admirers of, or have you watched the product? Bob, who do you think great wrestling minds?
Currently, David Marquez, the boss of Championship Wrestling from Hollywood. I know David casually. We've interacted several times. He's a smart guy who understands the concept of one's reach exceeding one's grasp. He's on right now, and I'm going to say about 80 markets and in 2 languages. And he's expanding constantly, and it is a very measured, managed growth. It's not going to run out from under him, and it's not going to roll over the top of him. In my opinion, David Marquez is the best brain in the business right now. Which isn't to say he could step into a senior exec role with WWE, but he is making the model of the territory promotion work in 2020, and he's doing a really good job of it.
I'm going to have to learn more about Mr. Marquez. I recognized the name, and when you said, I'm like, oh, he's an indie promoter, but that's all I knew about him.
Championship Wrestling from Hollywood is the name of the show, and it would be hard to find a TV market where it isn't on somewhere.
Isn't this where Adam Pearce came out of?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So he was a multi-time NWA champion for what it's worth.
Actually, I think David is loyal to the NWA brand, and his championships are considered NWA championships. Now, I'm not above standing corrected on that, but I know over the years that's come up a number of times.
I'm sure the NWA would be thrilled to have it.
Well, this is linear NWA going back to even before my time.
Who are the great minds you have that you've dealt with, John?
Let me see. Jim Cornette, obviously. Terry Funk. I mean, just was nothing short of brilliant when I was around him. Number 1, I would say Paulie Dangerously. I've been around Paul a few times, not recently, but I mean, I spent a lot of time with him the night of the 1991 Great American Bash. It was me, Paulie, and a few guys who listened to the podcast. And Paulie was absolutely brilliant. He saw the big picture. He saw the smaller picture. He had a lot of great ideas. We have this indie show on in the background that's on, has their show on 2 a.m. on a Sunday night. And he's picking apart the show, telling us, what's good, what's bad, what needs to be changed, etc. He had a lot of great ideas.
I'm going to go on to I haven't really been around anybody in the business who I would consider anybody, just some ECW guys. So I'll move on. I can't really think of it. I just have Eddie Graham and Bill Watts. So I have no personal stories that would add to it.
Watts is brilliant.
Oh, I'd say overall, yeah. And the total package. He got the wrestling and the TV. Guys like George Seal say that Vince McMahon got everything else but the wrestling.
Watts once told a story about being around Vern Gagne. This is in, I want to say, 87. And they were going out and they were going to get Mexican food. And Vern sees a Mexican restaurant and he goes, let's go here. And Watts is like, no, I know a really good place a couple of miles up the road. And Vern's like, Mexican food's Mexican food. And Watts says, that's the problem with you, Vern. You think Mexican food is Mexican food, and you think wrestling is wrestling. And at the end of the day, Watts was right.
Can you think of anybody who had a better all-around mind for the business as far as like every aspect of it, from the promo, TV, setting up the house shows, everything, just everything? Maybe Jarrett?
Maybe Jarrett. I would still say Bill Watts. I mean, he ran in Louisiana, which has a little bit of a reputation for being a corrupt state. And
a little.
Yeah, well, and he just knew how to get things done, and sometimes that means, whatever, $100 handshake or probably even more than that on some occasion. But he was making money, and another Watts-Vern comparison, I mean, as soon as Watts started losing money, he got the hell out. He had no sentimental attachment to this business. It's like, I'm losing money, I'm done. And then on top of it, he managed to get Jim Ross to convince Crockett to buy out his promotion. So no, he didn't get his whole $4 million, but I think he got like an extra $2 million, which is nothing to sneeze at, especially in the 80s.
No, not at all. Okay, next up from, I got a good one for this one. From David Winnick, and I apologize if I messed that up. If you could go back in time machine, Bob, with a video camera to film a match that doesn't exist on video, which match would it be? What do you think, Bob?
Summer of 1967, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Larry Hennig and Harley Race 8-fall Texas death match against Crusher and the Bruiser.
I like that one.
This is the Texas death match I grew up with, where a fall ends it and you have 30 seconds to, quote, toe the line, and then falls are unlimited.
You mean the rules?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. We've had extended discussions about the flippant way that the WWF treats the Texas death match.
It's an abomination in the eyes of a benevolent and loving God.
Thank you.
I've grown to appreciate them a little more as time has gone on.
I got a good one. Saturday night, August 31st, 1957, Akron, Ohio, at the Akron Armory. Buddy Rogers versus young Ray, billed as Ray Stevenson. Buddy Rogers versus Ray Stevens.
Wow.
If Stevens had enough experience by then, he probably did to have.
Oh, he was around for at least 6 years, but 7 years by that point.
Okay, that's a good one.
Oh, that's a magnificent match. I can't even imagine. But keep in mind, Buddy Rogers got out of this match saying, "This is one of the greatest I've ever seen," about Stevens.
Huh. I would love to see some early career Stevens.
Oh.
It just doesn't seem to be out there. But Dave Meltzer, raves about how great Ray Stevens was, like when he was growing up in the early 70s. So
before the accident, Bob, what do you have? You must have seen Ray.
Well, between television, he actually would work the weekday cards in the smaller towns a lot. So I got to see quite a bit of Ray Stevens. I saw a really tremendous match, Ray Stevens and Billy Robinson, in my hometown. And they went close to 40 minutes, and it was a clinic. It was just so much fun.
Oh. When he does, I think Jim Cornette gave a great description of it. The difference between the way Rick does that little flip in the corner, which is Jim calls an homage, which is a great word for it, and the way Ray did it, which is just violent. I mean, he goes hell-bent for leather, head first, ducks at the last second, goes flying up. He does this one number where he flips up and his head hits the turnbuckle, and then he flips back down again.
Yeah.
I mean, oh my God, he must have been to see this stuff in like 1958 in the Akron. Oh, how many people do you think were there? 1,000, maybe.
Well, this is the card. This is a Thursday night card in Burlington, Iowa. Population between 12 and 13,000. Dusty Rhodes versus Chris Markoff. Coincidentally, that was the opening match, and we've already talked about it tonight. Ivan Koloff against Bill Howard. Nick Bockwinkel against Don Morocco, which was an absolute clinic. Morocco was a very lean Rookie of the Year in the AWA. Bockwinkel was brand new to the territory. Nobody knew a thing about him, and these guys went about 30 minutes. And Bockwinkel didn't cheat once until the pinfall when he grabbed the trunks. And the main event was Billy Robinson against Ray Stevens. And I know there's an argument that Stevens, even in 1972, may have been a little long in the tooth, but they were both fantastic. Oh, and there were 2,600 people there for a town of 12 to 13,000.
And I will bet that the town Burlington, Iowa, did not have a lot of surrounding population.
No, it's the whole state is semi-rural. It's not like, well, there is such a dearth of things to do in Burlington, Iowa in 1972 that I imagine there were people there who drove 50, 60, 70 miles, but I didn't take a survey, didn't think to ask. So.
I know the feeling.
If I can expand on this just for one split second, we've talked about what we would do with respect to a single match, but there's a card I'm looking for right now, and it is a Chicago card from March of 1967. Let me just quickly rattle off the lineup. Dory Funk Sr. drew with Joe Blanchard. That's the opening match. Johnny Valentine defeated Eddie Graham. Reggie Parks drew Killer Kowalski. Lou Thez defeated Bob Geigel. Vern Gagne defeated Pat O'Connor. In the main event, Larry Hennig and Harley Race, no contest, Dick the Bruiser and the Crusher. Now, what is amazing to me about that card is how many of those people went on to major management in territories. I would almost rather be a fly on the wall for the behind-the-scenes meetings than in attendance at the wrestling. I think a lot of history was made there.
Bob, a quick aside on that, because you brought up a name who, when people think of him, made me think the little bald guy with glasses who used to come in to suspend people, Bob Geigel. Bob Geigel was a bad man in the ring. I mean, he was a realistic-looking, tough, bad man. We've posted clips of him just beating the tar out of people on TV on the Facebook page. Another reason to go look. Have you seen Bob Geigel in the ring back when he could, he was still going?
Oh, a lot in Central States. He and Bob Brown were fixtures in the Central States, and I always got the same sense from both Geigel and Pat O'Connor that they looked so realistic in what they were doing, and it was probably because they were actually beating the guy up. They were both really, really tough guys, and Geigel was just one of these guys, and the same sense I got from a young Dusty Rhodes. You could give me an axe handle to fight him, and it still wouldn't be a fair matchup because it just looked like it would be impossible to hurt him.
There's one clip with Geigel from, I think it's 68. I can't remember the guy's name. It's Ramirez was the guy's name.
Benny.
And he ended up being a referee in St. Louis, and Geigel just torches this guy. And before the match starts, I can't remember the announcer's name was. The announcer goes, "We want to keep in mind that the wrestler in the ring has had bleeding problems." Oh, man. Okay, this guy's getting roughed up. They're just setting everybody up for this. And then he smashes the guy, Geigel. Geigel just smashes the guy's nose. And I guess someone did it to him the week before, mentioning that, they come out for the interview and he goes, "Well, what should this wrestler do about his bleeding problem?" Wasn't it like, it had nothing to do with Bob's boot. So every time I watch, I'm just sitting there wondering they're sending in Geigel. I'm wondering what he possibly could have done. But I'm not a big fan of Bob Brown, but Geigel, when you see him from like the 50s and 60s, he is just rough.
I mean, the guy was a former Marine, and I think he was a Big Six champion, wrestling champion, heavyweight, I think at Kansas State?
Iowa State, I think.
Okay,
and he's from Algona, Iowa, and there's a little plaque thingy in the town square of Algona, Iowa, commemorating Bob Geigel. And for whatever reason, very early in his career, he was billed as being from Amarillo, Texas. Texas Bob Geigel.
Texas Bob.
From Algona, Iowa.
And we all know Iowa State is a major, major wrestling school. So if you're the heavyweight there, you're good.
I mean, and it wasn't just, when I mean realistic, like it reminded me of the squashes, the old Midnight Express squashes, when they look like they're just messing somebody up, back in like 85. I mean, it looks like he's torturing this guy. And it wasn't anything fancy. It was just him, hard moves, hard shots. And it was really physical. It was kind of I'm sitting there thinking of that Magnum TA moment again. And I wonder if it flipped through Bob's head to do a Harley race on him. like Harley did to him a few months earlier when he heaved him out of the ring like he was a frisbee.
Oh, Sean, I heard you use the phrase bleeding problems from that video, and I'm just somewhere picturing Vince McMahon listening to this right now going, God damn it, pal, how come we don't have a hemophiliac wrestler? Another Central States guy who was clearly past the he could beat up my dad test was Archie Gouldy, Mongolian Stomper. In Central States, he was a well-spoken, more or less babyface, and elsewhere he was a shrieking madman from outer Mongolia. But he was just a stomper in Kansas City.
They had this weird bit in Memphis where they decided he grew a mustache and they decided to have him talk. And this lasted a couple months when everyone realized that, first of all, okay, this Canadian accent doesn't exactly mean you're from Mongolia. So they had to shut him up again, and they threw Gorgeous George with him. So yeah, no, he was pretty much silent the entire time with that one exception that I could think of.
This was when he was in Memphis, 78?
Yeah, I want to say right before he went with Gorgeous George, I think.
Okay.
So that'd be like 77, right after the Bob. Yeah, it was like a weird face run for him or something like that. It was just odd. There's clips of it. It looks strange. The next question is Gareth Cross. What guy would have been a huge star if the territory survived but never made it after they collapsed? Bob, who do you think?
I wish I had a little more time to think about this question, but what a great question.
Here, let me come back to you in a second. Give you a second to think about it. I said Dr. Tom. He seemed like, I talked to Tom Pritchard. I think he was like maybe 7 or 8 years late, but I could see him going to Georgia, Florida, Mid-South, and having good runs in each one of those places, almost like a Dick Slater.
There was a guy California Championship Wrestling had who went as the Terminator Steve Strong. And I know there's been a couple guys use that name in professional wrestling. Bodybuilder build, wore these really creepy looking white contact lenses. I just thought that he had so much more in him. And once CCW folded up, I don't think I ever heard of him again.
He went to Calgary, assuming we're talking about the same guy, and I'm pretty sure we are. He was in Calgary like 87 and 88, and he wasn't good in the ring, but he had a really good look, and he had a very nasty heel persona. To this day, I don't understand why he didn't have a bigger career, because he looked tailor-made for the WWF, quite frankly.
I saw he stood out as just that guy who's head and shoulders above everybody else in California Championship Wrestling and seemed destined for major greatness. And I was wrong.
We all are sometimes. I think a guy who was hurt by the territories falling apart. I mean, Dick Slater was the top guy everywhere he went. And we're talking Georgia, San Antonio, Houston, Mid-Atlantic, Georgia, Florida. And then when the territories broke apart, Mid-South too. And as soon as that Mid-South run ended, it was like he wasn't right for a national promotion. Another guy, and I've said this on the show before, who's probably born just a little bit too late, was Mike Rotundo.
How much do you think Slater had left in the tank? I'm just concerned you're going to run into like a, I don't want to say buzzsaw, it was never that bad. But I mean, did you think he had, if the territory stayed, do you think he could have been good for another 10 years, say?
I might not say 10 years, but he was still really, really good when he was in Mid-South. And something seemed to drain out of him as soon as he got to the WWF. So I don't know. I mean, 10 years, but 7 or 8 years, I don't see why not.
Yeah, maybe. If Joe Blanchard keeps paying, this is from Thomas Bain, if Joe Blanchard keeps paying the USA Network on time, do the following things still occur? And do they occur in the same time frame as they did in reality? First, does Vince buy out the Briscoes? Is WrestleMania still held in March of 85? And does Rick continue as a touring champ and not become exclusive to Crockett? Let me take this one first. It's I would say, does Vince buy out the Briscoes? Yeah, because he doesn't have a spot. You need to get a TV spot, and that's the TV spot. You need some kind of a cable spot. So if he doesn't get the USA spot, then he has to get the TBS spot. Is WrestleMania still held March in 85? Yeah, I would say, yeah, because he would get the TBS spot. And do I think Ric Flair continues as the touring champ? Probably has to, because I'm not sure Crockett at that point, without that TV spot, can support him.
Good answer. How about you, Bob?
In order, yes, I think Vince will buy out the Briscoes. I think with the MTV backing, I don't think there was any way to prevent WrestleMania 1. I just don't think it would have been possible. Too many people had too much invested, and Ric Flair continuing as touring champ? I'm not sure. I'd like to think so, but your guess is as good as mine, truth be told.
Hey, that's what we do here. We have a lot of fun speculating what if scenarios. I used to watch the show, the Southwest Championship Wrestling show on USA Network, and it was right around the time that we started getting a lot of wrestling on television. By that point, we were getting 2 hours of WWF TV in syndication. We were getting world-class championship wrestling. Obviously, this is Boston area. We were getting WTBS on cable. And unless I'm forgetting, and let's not forget, too, that WTBS had the Saturday morning show and the Sunday evening shows, which were kind of throwaway shows, but hey, it's wrestling. And then Sunday, USA Network had Southwest Championship Wrestling. And just to take you back a little bit to that world, USA Network at that time was a really weak cable network. They were showing stuff on prime time. I don't know about prime time, but they were showing stuff that I was familiar with because it was stuff that would be on, early in the morning or late at night 5 years ago on UHF stations. That's how deep they were digging for content. Also, the Southwest program was definitely a lot more minor league in terms of not only the wrestlers and the wrestling, but in terms of production. You just couldn't help but notice that compared to Georgia, WWF World Class, etc., this was kind of a minor league promotion. So I think it was definitely good that Vince got that outlet. I think it benefited USA Network as much as it did the WWF. But I don't think if Joe Blanchard had stayed on, I don't think it would have made that much difference.
Real quick, because I don't even know anything about this. From Dylan, was there a Flair for Luger trade in 92 or 93? Was there, John?
No, there was not. You can't trade wrestlers the way
I didn't think so.
Baseball teams can trade players. Yeah, it was a totally different thing. Luger had made his decision to leave for the WWF, and it was right around the same time, so I can see it. Flair started to get the itch to come home and work WCW.
Okay, and last one we have from Thomas Dauber. Climaxing in the 1990s, you had the school of thought that a professional wrestler had to be at least 6 feet and weighing 220. Would you have agreed that with this sentiment when you started to watch wrestling, and have you ever changed your mind about it, Bob?
No,
What say
I want
you?
Professional wrestlers to be bigger and tougher than me. I think that's part of the mystique of it. That was part of the initial attraction. That's why there's no weight categories. They're all heavyweights.
Yeah. Throw this in real quick. Wrestling has had a junior heavyweight division, and I know there were some territories where that got over big time, but out here it just did not because the guys weren't big enough, and with the exception of that one or two Tiger Mask matches, the matches they weren't really, they didn't stand out enough quality-wise to make up for the fact that, hey, we quote unquote know that a middle of the card heavyweight could mop the floor with one of these guys.
I think it entirely depends on where you grew up watching wrestling. Up in the Northeast, the bigger the better, as it was here. And as far as, Bob, I think that was the same way in the Midwest too. Where you would, promote the bigger guys. But if you go down south, down to Memphis, down to Alabama, down to, you had a lot of really good smaller guys down there.
And then there's always the inflation factor in wrestling. Vern Gagne was always billed as being 235. Red Bastien was always billed as being 235. They were both ballpark 200, but, who was I to know that?
There's no way to know. I bought that in the Heights, too. I bought that hook, line, and sinker until I started getting the Observer.
It works as long as you scale everybody.
Yeah, good
Because
point.
by comparison, they all kind of look the same. It's only when you're like standing next to him in a live show, you're like, wait a minute.
That was my disillusionment with Mil Mascaras. For the love affair that magazines had with him in the 70s, to finally see him in person, and he still had the physique, but he's a tiny little guy.
Bill Apter's camera adds 6 inches.
I mean, my Mascaras moment when I first saw him in 77 after reading about him in the magazines for a year, but still, I thought I was going to see the most exciting guy that I'd ever laid eyes on, and he was just okay. And at the time, even as a kid, I'm like, wow, maybe, you just are holding him to too high a standard. And then I'd watch him again, and he wasn't that good. But if I may answer that question, first of all, I think every question submitted to Stick to Wrestling should begin with the word climaxing from now on. But secondly, there has to be kind of a like, I wouldn't say a size parameter. When Bill Parcells was the coach of the New England Patriots, he had size parameters. Like, you had to be X height, X weight at this position, or he's not drafting you. I think that's kind of staunch. Like, let's give up an inch or two and get Zach Thomas, who can play this game. But at the same time, there has to be some sort of limit on how small a guy can be. There's some guy in AEW who is just too damn small. He's like 5'2", and I just can't take him seriously. But at the same time, you can have a guy like Chavo Guerrero or a Ricky Morton who is small, but the fans believe it. When Ricky Morton would get in the ring with someone huge like Dr. Death Steve Williams, people wouldn't say, oh, Ricky Morton can't possibly fight this guy. Because, again, that's part
of the... on that.
Okay. People still came out to see it, though.
True.
So, yeah, I understand the line gets drawn somewhere, but I'm just not sure where that somewhere would be.
I think there has to be a happy medium between the AEW guy you just mentioned and the freak show that WWF became.
Yeah.
It's proportion.
Around the turn of the century.
Yeah, I mean...
It's all about proportion. If you have one guy who's of a certain size, you have to have like everybody kind of in the ballpark. So if you're going to go big, everyone's got to be big because the small guy's going to stand out. But on the other hand, if you're going to have a smaller roster, everybody has to be small. You didn't have a lot of giant guys going into Memphis until later on.
They had some big guys in Memphis. I know Austin Idol.
Yeah, but I mean, how big is Austin Idol? He's only 250?
He was a pretty blown up 250.
Yeah. I mean, he was more jacked, but he wasn't huge. Even Savage was only 230. I mean, you had the Stomper come in, but that was a special occasion. Sometimes you would have guys come in for spots. But, you couldn't have some guy twice the size of Lawler.
They did on occasion, though. But here's the thing. Like, for example, they had Hulk Hogan come in 1981. But it was, it was an exception. And you have, okay, well, Jerry Lawler is so damn tough. At his size, he can take this guy on. The important thing was that the people bought it.
That works as long as you only have Hogan in for the couple months that he was there.
He was there a couple of months, I want to say in 78, and then in 81, I think he made, I'm pretty sure it was a one-and-done appearance at the Mid-South Coliseum.
And if memory serves, he was on Jerry's team most of the time.
In 78, 79, he was a good guy, and then when he came back in 81, he was a heel managed by Jimmy Hart.
But again, that's the exception that proves the rule, because you always, as long as everyone's small, it makes sense.
I guess I just, I think as long as the fans buy it, but I mean, you're really pushing the parameters. The number one guy who pushed the parameters was Ricky Morton. Let's face it. I mean, he was just way smaller than everyone else, but he was over like crazy.
In Dundee.
Oh, yeah. In Memphis, that is true. Bill Dundee was a very small guy who managed to get over in that environment. God bless him.
So, again, it's how you're educated. So half the fans that hear us talking are like, what are you talking about? What's wrong with a smaller guy like that? And then the other half are going to be like, oh, of course, it's ridiculous. Because it was different in each territory.
Yeah. And, like I said, there's got to be a limit somewhere. I mean, a guy who's 4 feet tall is just not going to be you're just not going to be a pro wrestler in the heavyweight division. It's just, not realistic enough. I would once again like to thank Bob Parsons for coming on and giving us a really good segment. And now we're going to do a slightly shorter segment because something was released on YouTube like last week. It was a Mid-South wrestling show. It looked like it had a match or maybe a segment missing, but the whole thing went about 35 minutes. It was completely awesome. It was dated April 2nd, 1981, and that seems just dead right to me. And I've brought in Brandon Hefner to talk about this with the Stick to Wrestling audience. How are you, sir?
Doing well. Thanks for having me back, man. And I felt the same way. It was pretty amazing to see this thing just kind of pop up out of nowhere. And the guy's got nothing else really on his channel that I've checked. So I just wonder where the hell it came from, you know?
I know. I mean, the show is almost 40 years old. It's something I have never seen. I mean, I thought, I have like not or had or have like 90 to 95% of the stuff that's out there. For this to just appear was really cool. But anyway, first match was Don Diamond against Mike Hudspeth, and this goes to show you how much wrestling has changed. Bill Watts is doing commentary, and along with Boyd Pierce, and Watts talks about how Don Diamond was getting over the float.
Yes, I thought that was actually pretty amazing. And I don't know if he really had dropped any weight. I definitely remember Diamond from, the introducing and whichever Raptor mag it was. And he kind of disappeared as far as, I think, did you say he ended up a truck driver or owned a trucking company or something? But I thought he was really good. And the wrestling was really mat based, the whole match.
Yeah, I always liked Don Diamond. He made an appearance in Madison Square Garden once, and according to him, he had been in the wrestling business for like 5 years, and he basically said, hey, if I haven't made it yet, I'm not going to make it. I'm moving on. And it sounded like he didn't have a great love for the road, or he wasn't like addicted to the business like a lot of guys are.
Sure. And some, I just wonder how much it matters when somebody is a fan when they are a kid to whether they just kind of got into it because they were told, seen and said they had a nice build and, hey, you want to try this? And they just didn't kind of have the passion for it. So who knows if that played into it or not as well. Didn't he work in Florida a bit as well, maybe?
Florida was more or less his main territory. That's where he started in like 79, 80. He was back there like 81, 82. And right around the beginning of 83 is when he said like he kind of tapped out on the business.
Yeah, and it might have been, maybe it was one of those things if he would have come along and 10 years earlier, he would have done a lot better because it was, even by 83, we know how fast things changed that year just in the WWF even. So
that business was changing quickly. And, not everyone likes Jim Wilson, the guy who exposed the business and wrote that book and all that good stuff. But I mean, Jim Wilson made a really good point about the wrestling business. He's like, a lot of guys cannot get out of the wrestling business because they don't want to get up in the morning and have a real job.
Sure. Yeah.
It's
and
the truth.
What's funny is that's the one book pretty much out of all of them that I haven't read. And I guess I need to pick it up. And I'm sure I know enough now to kind of pick out the half truths and that kind of stuff out of it. Cause I'm sure there's, some of his bias in there, but it's a pretty good book. I take it.
Oh, the book was okay. I thought the book was, it was okay. It's not, definitely don't read it or make sure you read it. He told a story in there. He played football at the University of Georgia, and he said when he was a freshman, he got mad and he challenged the entire football team, and everyone backed down. And that has zero chance of being true. I mean, if you did that at Nashua High, they'd find you in the plumbing the next day.
Exactly.
Goddamn freshman, get out of here. But anyway, Diamond's opponent is someone named Mike Hudspeth, who I have never seen before. Didn't look that good. Just one quick comment. I've known of two people in the world with the last name Hudspeth. This guy is number 2, and number 1 is Mark Hudspeth, who was the head coach at the University of Louisiana Lafayette. So what a big coincidence.
I'll tell you one thing that I like that he did, and it was sort of instinct. Diamond dropped down, was about to do a fireman's carry, or he might have thought he was going to do a fireman's carry, but he just wanted him to go back, and he instinctively dropped back instead of going over. So I thought that was one cool thing that he did, which isn't much, but I noticed it.
You know what? I didn't notice it. You're better than I am. Second match, we have the Junkyard Dog teaming up with Dick Murdock against Larry Booker, who was about to become a Moondog, and someone named Hans von Bronner. And I do not like it when jobbers have gimmicks.
No, and I made a note last night to ask you. I'd never heard of this Von Bronner guy, or I didn't notice him. Obviously, Booker I knew from the Blonde Bombers in, Memphis. So he was sort of a name, but the other guy, I have no clue who he was.
No, I've never heard the name, and I looked at him. I've never seen him before, so obviously he was one of those guys trying to break into the business, and like many of them are not successful. One thing I always liked about Mid-South, you mentioned Larry Booker as one of the Blonde Bombers. They usually had some top-flight undercard talent. They didn't just have like Frank Williams and Jose Estrada like the WWF did.
Well, yeah, and that always helped the younger guys work, or learn to work, because they were more of a carpenter or whatever than a just straight jobber. So you get a guy like Booker or Latham, whatever his real name was, and he comes in and, from working the Mid-South Coliseum in Louisville and everywhere, I think he probably had a lot to teach a young guy back then.
Yeah, absolutely. Junkyard Dog, if you, the listener, have only seen the WWF or, God forbid, the WCW version of Junkyard Dog, you need to see him here. He is an absolute stud.
Yeah, just an animal. So thin waist, huge chest and shoulders, just insane. I agree.
And he wasn't never a great worker, but they were smart in the way they used him. He didn't have long matches on TV, so you never got tired of the guy. And Murdock and Dog just came in and started pounding on these guys. It was basically a tornado match, and the referee allowed it to go on. And Murdock looked like he just about killed Booker with that brain buster.
Yes, he did. It was, or did he? I think he had the grappler up, actually. I just watched it again this morning. I could be wrong, but whichever one it was, yeah, he dropped him on his head pretty good.
And, they did the thing where the brain buster and the power slam came simultaneously. So it was a fun but short match. Do you have any other observations you'd like to share on this match?
No, I mean, you pretty much explained it. Just kind of, they did it sure as a treat for the fans. They just came in and wrecked people. And, this was 2 years before the Road Warriors. So, I'm sure people had seen it somewhat, but just a total destruction to get those two guys over for what was coming up, the cards that they were obviously promoting, and then the Superdome deal as well, I guess.
Oh, yeah. Now we get to the steak on the plate. Bad Leroy Brown and Ernie Ladd do a local promo. Now, let me give everyone a little bit of background on how we got here. Junkyard Dog is wearing a patch on his eye, and it's because he has double vision in that eye. So basically, he needs not to use it. This happened when he was blinded by the Freebirds in New Orleans about a year earlier, which led to just an insane scene from what I've heard. People dousing Dog's eyes with beer and soda in the audience, trying to dilute what Michael Hayes just put in. And JYD had been wrestling with the patch for about a year. Ernie Ladd and Leroy Brown say that they're going after his eye. That is remarkable. That is so vicious. And in a way, it makes it real.
They wouldn't be allowed to do it today, or, even a little while ago. The thing that struck me about Brown, I'd seen him in Georgia and stuff, but he'd really played up the kind of psycho deal or in Memphis, and he was definitely doing that here, just kind of had his thumb in his eye with the, bugging out and just saying again, your eye over and over. So he was definitely an intimidating big guy, and Ernie's just Ernie. I've always loved the lad, just amazing,
Oh, yeah.
And the whole poster and the, who they've already taken out and who they're going to take out. But yeah, just great old school stuff, no doubt.
Oh, it was great old school stuff. They were doing a deal where Ladd and Brown kept injuring Junkyard Dog's tag team partners. They wanted JYD, but he wasn't as easy to get as someone like Killer Carl Cox. And Ladd comes out with this poster board with pictures of the guys that they've already taken out, and they've got open spots for number 5 and 6, which is going to be JYD and Dick Murdock.
Yes, and one of the things that Watts did that made him so good on the commentary was he mentioned how tough that Murdock knew that Cox was, because he'd had his previous wars with him, and how that even if he didn't like those two, he definitely respected them because of what they did to Cox to take him out, showing that even he could be scared of him. So.
And then the interview ends with Ernie Ladd looking into the camera and saying how disgusted he was that Junkyard Dog would team with a redneck.
Exactly. That was beautiful.
And it made it all seem so real. Like, you weren't going to go to see a show if you were going to that event they were promoting. You were going to see 4 big guys fight to the death.
Yes, and that's, I try to watch the newer stuff and like it, and it's just like it's so obvious they don't mean it. And back then, we all knew that something was up, but there was always 2 or 3 things per hour that you were just like, that makes me wonder. Those guys there make me wonder, and they were just so good because they did it every single night. And then, the interviews every single week, and they, maybe Watts gave them some bullet points or whatever, but it was all on them, and it was their own words. And just that emotion's not there anymore. And that was just pure emotion, that had, people going crazy down there because you had a lot of blacks, and then you had a lot of rednecks as well. So Watts definitely knew his audience and how to market to him, for sure.
No, he was not shy about that. You were talking about how it seemed real and how it's not the same nowadays. About 3 years ago, they did a segment on the SmackDown post show where they were talking with The Miz, and it was The Miz and Maurice, and they were in the middle of a feud with John Cena.
I remember that.
Yeah, and Miz made it seem like, I take a step back. I'm like, something is up for real between these two guys. And whether or not there was, Miz got my attention. It was like he was like the one guy in the last 10 years who could pull that off.
And you just wonder if it was because they let him loose because it was an after, deal segment that wasn't, and they just said, go out and do it. And he didn't have to worry about hitting every little thing they said. And he just kind of did it. But I actually remember that as well.
Yeah, it was a great segment. All right. Now, next match, the Grappler and the Super Destroyer taking on Kelly Kiniski and Ashura Hara, who I had no idea, first of all, that Ashura Hara was in Mid-South.
No clue. Don't remember seeing him in results in the magazines or anything, or any other territories as well. So I just wonder, if he maybe came into, this would have been after the Funks were gone from Amarillo though, so probably wouldn't have gone there to work. But he was definitely a tough guy, and in Stan Hansen's book, he's got a good story about another reckless Hansen story, hitting him from behind when he was stepping out of the ring during a tag match, and he hit him too hard and he stumbled and smacked his face on the ring post and, just gashed him all the way around his eye and put a huge horseshoe cut. And he, said the next night he asked him about it, and he just smiled at him and said, it's good for business. So definitely a tough guy, and Hansen really put him over as a tough guy and one of his favorite opponents over there as well.
I had no idea. That's one of the books on my list I absolutely need to read. It's only been out like 10 years and I haven't gotten around to it yet, but
it's really
definitely
good.
Will. All right, I will take that. As a matter of fact, you know what? I will order it today. How's that? All right. Let me see. So we've got the Grappler. Now, a lot of people don't know about this. The Grappler got a huge push in Mid-South around this time. He was the North American champion for like 9 or 10 months. They did a gimmick where Ted DiBiase injured him with the figure 4 leg lock, and he came back like 6 weeks later with an orthopedic boot. The boot was like 2 inches taller or had like a 2-inch heel on it. The other one didn't have. And Grappler explained, yeah, this way I keep the weight off of my bad leg. Oh, okay, that makes sense. But, as a wrestling fan, I'm kind of like, okay, something's going on here.
Exactly.
And the next thing, Grappler is like loading up that boot against Ted DiBiase, and he kicks him in the stomach, and DiBiase acted like it killed him.
Right. And, that's the first time I remember anybody doing that gimmick or seeing it in the magazines. I'm sure somebody probably might have done it before, but me personally, that's the first time I'd seen it. And I definitely remember seeing pictures of his feud with Wahoo in the magazines, and Wahoo laying through the ropes all bloody from, getting kicked in the head with it. And he was also the Louisiana champ at the same time on this show, which I thought was, odd that Watts pushed him that hard for him to be, the dual champ.
Yeah, I loved the old Mississippi and Louisiana titles. I thought that was so unique, and I understand why they had to get rid of it. Watts actually went on TV and explained that, hey, we can't have a Louisiana title, a Mississippi title, an Arkansas title, an Oklahoma title, a Texas title, so they got to go.
Right.
And that's when he started pushing the TV title, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, and that's just one of the things about him, his psychology, and he always explained it to everybody, so everything made logical sense, and that's why it was such a good show for so long.
Yeah. I loved Mid-South Wrestling. To this day, I miss it. I'm glad it's available on the WWE Network. Grappler and Super Destroyer had a manager named Frank Dusek. I mention that because this guy was practically invisible. I have no idea what his purpose was out there.
Me neither. And then a year later, he's in, world class. Wasn't he Texas champ or something for a long time? This was before the Freebirds came in, obviously, and maybe he was just a body, but I had remembered him being a manager, but you're right, he was faceless. He was a decent wrestler, I guess, no color or anything, but maybe Watts was just giving him a job because he was a nice guy.
You never know in wrestling. Kelly Kiniski. Now, here's a guy, Ted DiBiase was talking about him once. He said that Kelly Kiniski was the single least charismatic wrestler ever. And here's a guy, he's Gene Kiniski's kid. So right there, you've got an advantage ahead of everyone. Your dad's a former NWA champion, and he wasn't bad in the ring, but Ted was right. This guy was colorless.
Yeah, anywhere he ever went, and I could, I was only 11, back then getting the mags and whatnot, but even then I could just kind of see, unless something really changed, that he probably wasn't going to do much. And, Gene was a smidge before my time, but just from seeing him in the magazines, you knew who he was, and that he was a giant in the business. But yeah, I didn't really like Kelly, and he didn't show me much in this, seeing him, almost 40 years later either. And I'm sure he was a great athlete and all that, but just kind of never hit with anybody, I guess.
No, his brother Nick, I thought, had some potential, but nothing really happened for him either. Let me see. They had a cool finish. First, Super Destroyer does a standard shoulder breaker on the knee, and then Grappler drives Hara's shoulder into the mat for the finish. And I thought that was a cool combination.
Absolutely, yeah. And I always loved Super Destroyer. I always thought he was great, especially with him and Mass Superstar together were phenomenal.
Yeah, I mean, sadly, we're nearing the end of the era of masked wrestlers, and that certainly would never fly, now in the internet era.
Sure, yeah, and back then it was sort of like the Kiss thing. They could keep their identity, unknown. I remember forever wanting to know who the hell exactly Mr. Wrestling 2 was, because I'd never heard of Johnny Walker, before him. I guess I was a little too young, and that's probably one of the first things I searched on the internet when I, finally got it, to try to find out who the heck the guy actually was. And then when I heard it, was like, well, shit, I didn't know him anyway.
I know, that was perfect. Yeah, I mean, I remember they had a TV match in 81 or 82 with Andre the Giant against the Black Demon, I think it was, under a mask in the WWF. And at the end of the match, Andre just grabbed this guy by the mask and threw him, and the mask came off, and the arena went nuts wanting to know who this, this jobber guy was under a mask. I mean, it created its own intrigue.
Yeah, because you just didn't see that. I mean, the top guys would fight to get a guy's mask off, and it just seemed like it was almost impossible to do. So whenever it happened, people definitely popped for it.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I've said this before. I mean, when I first started watching wrestling, the Masked Executioners or the WWF Tag Team Champions, I was dying to know who they were. And, it was a good comparison you just made, like the Kiss thing. We all wanted to know what these four guys looked like without the makeup. We cared for some crazy reason.
Exactly. And, no rhyme or reason to it. You just had to know and wanted to know. But yeah, I've always thought it was a good comparison.
All right. Next up, Junkyard Dog and Dick Murdock do their interview responding to Ladd and Brown. And I mean, once again, it's a great interview. Both guys are on. Both guys are serious enough. And, they're coming to fight.
Yes, for sure. And, I don't know if it was a real tension because they were playing it up, but there was just kind of a weird vibe, I thought, with those two standing there. And then with some of the subject matter they got into that was, was real underlying,
Yes.
Almost subliminal. But maybe Murdock was just such a pro that he was able to seem like there was just some kind of tension there. But, I'm sure the subject matter had something to do with it as well. Without naming names, he said quite a bit during that segment, actually.
Like you said, he made it subtle enough, but I'm sitting there going, "Oh man, Dickie, calm down." But it worked.
Yes, for sure. And I think the fans there loved seeing that together, and those two come together to do that. But yeah, it was a pretty hot segment, I thought.
Yeah, I would definitely. I mean, I'm a wrestling fan anyway. I would want to buy a ticket, but those two segments made me really want to buy a ticket. Anyway, main event: Jim Garvin against Leroy Brown. This is pre-gorgeous Jimmy Garvin, where he's just kind of a white meat babyface against Leroy Brown. One thing that I really liked Bill Watts doing is right away he addressed the size difference between these two. And he says Jim Garvin is winning because he has wrestling skill and he understands leverage.
Exactly. That's the first thing I noticed as well. And it got it over because at first I was a little shocked. It's like he's dominating and then he's just explaining, why, because the basic wrestling, his, older brother, cousin, uncle was Ronnie Garvin. He learned all the vicious stuff from them, but he decided to go the, clean scientific route. And yeah, I thought that was really cool how Watts just kind of wove that in there and made the viewer kind of understand why Leroy wasn't just kind of kicking the snot out of him.
Yeah, and you know what? Watts goes out there, and I'm not putting down the modern product, but it's almost like you're sometimes when I watch like WWE today, it's almost like the announcer. It's the same thing as a video game. He's just out there, blah 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 blah. Watts is making point after point, driving everything home.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's just a huge difference. And I understand why the guys today have to do it. I'm sure some of them would have been great in, the kind of old situation. But, if they've got Vince screaming in their ear about, shill this and shill that. And like I said, I understand why they have to do it that way and why it's different now. It's just not as fun to me,
No, definitely not. I mean, I haven't watched Raw in a long time. I watch the pay-per-views, but I don't watch Raw. But, I mean, they would drive me nuts with that whole download the app every 5 minutes thing. Anyway, one thing I wanted to mention, Watts goes out and he's talking about the fight they had at the Superdome where Duran quit against Sugar Ray Leonard. And Watts says, we don't have guys quitting in the middle of the fight like Sugar Ray Robinson did. And he couldn't think of Duran's name.
Yeah, he couldn't think of either of their names. He got them both wrong.
And I'll tell you something, like, maybe 2 years ago, I was just like, but I get it. Now that we do a podcast for an hour a week, I do understand the brain fart that Bill Watts had. It happens. You're out here and the bullets are flying.
Yeah, and, he was probably mortified himself because he didn't slip up like that much. But I did kind of chuckle, and I immediately got on Google and looked up when the fight was, and I guess it was just the previous November, so it hadn't been that long, but just whoosh, you know?
Yeah.
Another cool thing that I thought he did during that first match when he talked about Boyd going on vacation to Hawaii, him mentioning buying a new plane and going to California to learn about some of the deal. I don't know if you caught that during, but I guess he was even flying back then. It was just kind of funny to hear him talking about owning his own plane even back then.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Watts did not care. I mean, back in, was it 86, we would get like weekly updates on what college Erik Watts was going to play quarterback at.
Right.
He'd be playing his kid's high school football highlights on the wrestling show.
Yeah. So he definitely had a nice size ego, but that's probably why he was as successful as he was as well.
I couldn't agree more. But anyway, we have a DQ finish. It appears that Leroy Brown has won the Louisiana title after a ref bump. A second ref comes in and counts Garvin out. The first ref takes the title away and says that Brown had used a chain. The crowd goes nuts. Everyone's jumping up and down because Brown didn't really win the title.
Yes, and they knew. We'd been so conditioned by then, you know, even at 10 and 11, I knew you'd see it happen to Dusty almost every week somewhere, either Georgia or Florida. And you just knew as soon as that second ref came in, it wasn't going down and I think I even mentioned when we were doing the group watch on Facebook, I just wrote, I knew it. I just knew that he wasn't taking the belt. So, but the crowd went nuts and, they loved their baby faces back then. There wasn't any gray area. They cheered who they thought was the good guy and booed the bad guy for sure.
Mid-South for sure. I mean, up here it was very similar, but it wasn't like as straight out as Mid-South. I would be afraid to go to one of those arenas and cheer for Ted DiBiase when he was a heel.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I love some, Corny's and the guys' stories about the heat that they got there. And I'm sure it was even worse in the 70s, because by 84, things had even kind of calmed down and things were pretty crazy. I can't imagine some of the heat the Freebirds got during that dog angle. Had to have been insane.
Oh, I mean, we've heard the story about how some guy, they were going to go after JYD, and some guy in the audience says, "Don't worry, dog, I got your back." And he shows him a loaded gun.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that very thing. Exactly.
All right, so the referee now. Oh, again, another detail I like. The referee comes over to the desk, explains why he called for a disqualification, and he did it. It was quick. He wasn't putting heat on himself. It just here's what happened, and Garvin's still the champion. So Ernie Ladd had come out to congratulate Brown on his new championship while this is going on. So now the heels decide they're going to go after Jim Garvin. 2-on-1, two big guys. Leroy Brown and Ernie Ladd are coming after Garvin. So what does he do? He leaves. I thought that was brilliant.
Yes. I mean, that's exactly what I would do. And, Garvin wasn't that big anyway. So to me, that just goes back to the psychology of Watts. He told him, you hightail it. You're not going to stand and fight. Because I think he thought that's what most people would really do. But yeah, just those little tiny things made a huge difference in the whole psychology of it. No doubt about it.
And most baby faces would sit there and try to take on these two guys and wind up getting killed. And Garvin just says, "Nope, I'm out of here." I loved it.
I'm out of here. Yeah.
Well, Brandon, thank you for coming on this segment. I wanted to get it out as quickly as I could because it just got on YouTube and you want to watch it as soon as you can. It was really good. Thank you again, Brandon.
Absolutely, man. No problem. Appreciate it.
All right. That wraps up our special segment with Brandon Hefner. We wanted to get it out there as quickly as possible because, I mean, let's face it, everyone's going to be watching that show. So, yeah, that was a fun segment. Thank you, Brandon Hefner. That wraps up another fun week of Stick to Wrestling. I want to thank our convivial co-host, Sean Goodwin, for everything he does. I want to thank Lou Kippelman, our producer. And this has been a production of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network. Go Vols.